Senator Grassley told me the other day that he thinks there may be an opportunity for a deal on budget control, perhaps with Republicans being willing to allow spending higher than the current levels on sequestration or the Budget Control Act in exchange for longer-term entitlement reform. I want to ask you if you would agree with that approach, and secondly, do you believe that revenue should be on the table at all as you're talking about balancing the budget?
I wouldn't agree with that at all. And if I were in the United States Senate, I would have have the respect for Senator Grassley to go and talk to him and tell him I would respectfully disagree with him. The whole notion that we have to bargain away entitlement reform to get at the spending issue is really again kicking the can down the road. How many promises have been made? I'm old enough to remember the 1980s when we went through this deal with Ronald Reagan, where he was promised, $1 of $3 of tax or of spending cuts for every dollar of revenue increase. Did that ever materialize? Not at all. Do you trust anybody in the Congress to keep their word? I don't think so. So I think what you ought to do is you go in there, you bargain from a position of strength, and that's deal on spending. And talk about the economics of where we are today. The economics of where we are today is that we have this massive uncertainty that exists for every person in America, every business, every human being. We have to go in and say, if we want to continue down this path, we have to grow revenue by increasing the base of our economy. Here's the thing you ought to do about that. Let's go ahead and cut corporate taxes. You realize the United States has the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world? I would like to see the corporate tax rate cut to 10%. 10%, and have a repatriation at the same rate. Imagine now removing the excuse of all these companies that have taken their businesses overseas to bring those businesses back here, that work back here, and then employ the best workforce in the world. Those are the things that really have to be done. Lower taxes by going to a fair tax where you tax consumption and not production. Allow people then to grow the economy because the base increases and everyone has skin in the game. This is the time for tax reform, not for entitlement reform, because with tax reform, entitlement reform will follow.
Thank you, Sam. Paul.
As I stand here, I'm intrigued by the fact that me, her, him, every one of these 4 out of 6 on the stage said we need a balanced budget amendment. So that's not news. What's news is one that will work. Mine will work. I wrote a book in the mid-1980s, Great Restraint, and I included that balanced budget amendment. I wrote another book in 2008, published essentially the same balanced budget amendment, begged people to introduce it. Nothing. Faxed it to every member in our congressional delegation in January and February of this year. Gave them all a copy of the book. What do I have to do? Well, I have to introduce it because they won't. And that's the truth of the matter. They won't do it. I will. I wrote the darn thing. And the reason it will work is it takes away from Congress the power to borrow money. Takes it away. Says Congress shall have no power to spend money on the credit of the United States, borrow money on the credit of the United States or otherwise. Now, there are a couple of exceptions that have to be made. War and great national emergency, but otherwise, no more borrowing. Stop it. Okay, now, fund it. We have this amount of spending. Congress has approved it. So we first of all have to fund that, which means we have to come up with $1 trillion to balance the budget. And there's only one way to do it: easily, quickly, unpainfully. I'll tell you about it next time I get a chance to talk.
Thank you.
Oh boy.
Thank you.
Quivering anticipation.
Thank you. I don't agree with
Senator Grassley on that point. I do believe that we need long-term entitlement reform. We know that if you look at Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare, the three of those programs combined now make up 10% of our GDP. And within my lifetime, over the course of next several decades, it will double to 20%. We know that's not sustainable. So I agree we need to reform entitlements, but not at raising our levels of sequestration. We do have to cut our spending, and just as we've all talked about here, we have a $17 trillion debt, and we do have to address that, whether it's through the balanced budget amendment or cutting. But again, I'm going to agree with Sam. We have to grow our economy, and again, by doing that, by stimulating the economy, we do that by repealing Obamacare, replacing with those market-driven solutions, lowering taxes immediately for hardworking families, but we also eventually need to scrap the entire tax code that we have now and replace it with pro-growth economic policy. I think that would be very important. And then we also need to stop the government overreach and the burdensome rules and regulations. And here in the state of Iowa, we have worked very hard at that, making Iowa business friendly. And we have attracted those new employers, new job creators, so that more of our Iowans are going to work every day. And that's what we need to do, is take some of these solutions to Washington, D.C., and then we shouldn't be worrying about raising the level of sequestration.
Thank you, Joni. David Young.
Well, I don't know what the grand bargain would look like, but we don't need to be raising taxes. Our taxes are too high as they are. We need to lower the corporate tax rate. I don't know to what level, but anything's better than what it is now. It's the highest in the world. We need to make it certain and permanent. You know, I go out to all across Iowa, and I meet entrepreneurs and investors and manufacturers, and they say, I want to play in this economy, but I don't know the rules 1, 2, 3 years out. But I want to create jobs and get this economy going. We need to get rid of the death tax. We need to keep our family farms within our families and our small businesses within our families. We need to look at the fair tax and the flat tax, and let's have that debate, but we have to make it flatter, fair, and simpler. But really, we have to get at spending. Balanced budget amendment. But there's so many places within the federal government. You know, during sequestration, you know, they said the sky was going to fall and there'd be people in the streets, but, you know, maybe the cuts weren't prioritized and deliberate, but you know what? The sky didn't fall. There's plenty of fat on the federal budget, and there's plenty more that could be trimmed on it. You can start by, you know, let's peel back our dues to the United Nations by 25%. There's $2 billion a year. You know, let's make sure Common Core, the Department of Education, isn't out there. That'll save some money. Let's go to the EPA and make sure that they're not flying drones over our farms. That'll save some money. Let's make sure that they've done that. And let's make sure that cap and trade doesn't go forward. That'll save money. But we have to cut spending. We cannot be raising taxes on this economy. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Matt Whitaker.
Let's talk about the Budget Control Act and sequestration, which came from it. The interesting thing that no one points out here is only in Washington, D.C., is cutting the size of growth of government a cut. Where I come from, that's just slower growth. And that's the challenge, is there is such a disconnect between the lens that I look at Washington, D.C. through, where if you just bend the curve of growth a little bit, all of a sudden, as David says, the sky is falling, to where I come from, which is a cut is a cut. It means you get less year over year. And the Budget Control Act didn't do that. And so the fact that there is this chorus of folks in Washington, D.C. that want to trade growing government at a faster rate than it already is for long-term entitlement reforms just seems like not a bargain that I would take. But let's be clear about this. My generation, my children that are here tonight, Social Security is a tax. Medicare is a tax. There is no hope that Social Security, as it currently exists, will be there for me or for Calvin Allison and Lincoln or for anybody of our generation. So we do need entitlement reform, and it needs to be not a Republican solution, not a Democrat solution. It needs to be an American solution where we come and make the tough choices. Because we have it is unsustainable on the path we're on, and we're just continuing to leverage future generations and raise their taxes. I think it's immoral. I think it is the fight I want to join in Washington, D.C., and if we don't have politicians that are willing to talk about how we fix it, then they're just turning a blind eye to our most critical crisis that we face as a country. So, as a United States Senator, I will go there, and not to win the next election, but to change the mood, the tone, and the way business is done in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Matt. We'll complete the question with Scott Shade.
Thank you very much. We need to look at both spending reform and ways to generate revenue. Right now, we've got ourselves negotiated into a very, very ugly corner. Because anything that the rest of the Republic, we cannot cut our way to a balanced budget. Every time you turn around, the Democrats and our budget is cut into two ways of spending. We have mandatory spending and we have discretionary spending. You want to touch mandatory spending, the Democrats are going to cut you down. We're spending $3.6 trillion every year right now. $2.4 trillion of that's mandatory spending. 85% of that $2.4 trillion is Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So now you're left with your discretionary spending. That sounds like, hey, that's just pork, right? Wrong. Because then you get introduced to another term that says non-defense discretionary spending. So you say, well, that means there's defense discretionary spending? You betcha. Half of our discretionary funds is our defense. So that leaves you with $600 billion, or $600 billion if you were to cut your way out of discretion, to use discretionary spending to cut your way to a balanced budget. That's not going to happen. I'm going to speed up here to go into, we're going to have to touch everything. So whether it is the some of our mandatory spending, our long-term social programs, we're going to have to look at that, ways to make them more viable so that they don't drain us. But also we're going to have to look at ways to generate revenue. Long and short, people say to me, gee, Scott, you got a lot of guts. You're running for United States Senate. I say, no, that doesn't take guts. It takes 2 forms, 6 pages total. You fill them out, you're a candidate for the United States Senate. Okay. You want to know what it takes guts to do? It takes guts to open up a small business. You visit with small business owners and they're going to tell you right out. They don't know if they're doing everything right. Chances are they're doing something illegal. But you know what? They'll wait till the government tells them.
Thank you, Scott.